Welcome to the Notorious Scoundrels, a Star Wars Legion podcast bringing you the latest news, general perspective, and competitive discussion.
Hello and welcome back to the Notorious Scoundrels podcast. I'm Kyle. I'm here with Mike and David and Zach. Did you guys do anything fun this weekend?
Describe fun.
Yeah, I feel like that's a loaded question.
When you have two kids at home, as you know, Kyle, there is no such thing as a weekend. Basically, it boils down to you sit down with the kids and play with them from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night. And then when you finally get them to sleep, you have basically a decision to make. Do I stay up really late and enjoy myself, or do I go to sleep and catch up on the sleep that I probably need? Now, Saturday night, I stayed up playing video games until 2 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up on Sunday morning and I was like, why did I do that to myself? So the 5 hours of relaxation that I got was actually a negative result because I felt bad on Sunday for doing it because I woke up at like 6 a.m. No, probably like 5:45. And this house is a little intense because I've got a 3-year-old who we're potty training slowly because he's being stubborn about it. And I have a baby that spits up after she eats quite a bit, so she has to sit up. So it's like, I got to try and balance here. So at 5:45 in the morning on Sunday, after staying up until 2 o'clock playing video games, I was downstairs in the bathroom with my kid sitting on the potty. Horrible life decision. I thought it was great in the moment. So to answer your question, no, I did not have a fun weekend.
Let's be clear. The life decision you're talking about is staying up late playing video games, not having children, right?
No, yes, it was staying up playing video games.
I don't know. They both sound kind of questionable to me. But...
Well, just so the listeners know, I am sitting on a ticking time bomb known as my daughter behind me in this room, actually, as we record. My wife is working, and I am solo dad tonight. So if you see a 3-month-old child pop onto the screen this week, it's just because that be the ways this week.
Feel you, man. I feel you. Well, we took the kids to Shenandoah Valley and did some hiking. So I know the infant stage is tough, but once you get a little bit older, then you can actually have some fun with them.
I mean, I shouldn't say that. We brought the kids to see Toy Story at a drive-in last night on Sunday night.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yes and no. It is, it's like drive-ins are great. It's just getting the kids to sit down for those for the hour and a half and not be restless is tough because we got a new van. So he thinks he can walk around in it. So, but it was fun. So Sunday was fun. Saturday night was a bad life choice by me.
Yeah, getting the kids to actually pay attention to TV seems like it should be easy, but there's a reason that Thomas the Tank Engine is 6 minutes long per episode.
Is that really how long it is?
Yes, it's really short.
Yeah, the original ones are about that. The newer animated ones are a little bit longer, but most kids shows are 10 minutes or less.
I didn't. Yeah. Are they just all commercials? What?
No, they do
segment. They're segmented.
Yeah,
there's multiple if you see Thomas the Train on TV and it's a 30-minute episode, say, it's really 4 episodes in one with 6 minutes of commercials.
Yeah. So when I was growing up.
Oh man, the man's got a prop.
Wow.
Shit.
Oh wow.
When I was growing up, so it was divided into segments. So you had the segments with the models, right, which were what everybody wanted to see because it was really awesome. Back in the early '90s, growing up watching it
with Alec Baldwin doing the narrating.
Right, exactly. Then you had with George Carlin, yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And then you had the live action segments with the act of the kids, and George Carlin was there too in his conductor uniform. And so it was always the train station, and they were there would be some story and some life lesson. Oh man, that takes me back. What is it? Henry in the tunnel. He wouldn't come out because the rain would spoil his paint. Oh yep. Man, that was.
I'm not gonna lie. I was not expecting that Thomas the Train to come out.
I wasn't either. I also learned something new today. I didn't realize. I watched it when I was a little kid, but I didn't know that Alec Baldwin and George Carlin were in it. That's a hot fact of trivia, right?
Yeah,
there.
When it came over, it started in the UK. When it came over to America, they tabbed George Carlin to be the narrator.
I mean, George Carlin is awesome. So
yeah, But like you don't really think like a kids show and then 7 words you can't say on TV.
Yeah, no,
it's a little bit.
What I remember George Carlin for is definitely not Thomas the Tank Engine.
Thomas the Tank Engine primarily, no.
Yeah, definitely not Alec Baldwin either. It's a long way from Glengarry Glen Ross.
I
mean, while we're down this off-topic rabbit hole, I do want to say rest in peace to Alex Trebek as we discuss this, because like we're talking about like iconic people and things like right now, and I don't know if there's anyone that could ever fill those shoes. Like I've thought about it. I'm sure whoever fills his shoes is basically going to crap their pants forever, because that guy was like the consummate like pro. Like that is like he was the guy. Like that is like the guy that we all grew up and watched Jeopardy for years and years, and he's going to be truly missed. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, Sean Connery and Alex Baldwin in the space of a week.
I'm
sorry. I'm not Alec Baldwin. Alex Trebek. Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Still got my brain on Alec Baldwin. Please don't die, Alec Baldwin.
That is dead brain for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Let's actually talk about Legion. So let's do some housekeeping real quick.
Housekeeping.
So we mentioned this last week, but we do have some new products up on the site, some GW stuff, paints, and pre-orders for some new miniatures. Check those out at thefifthtrooper.com/shop. You can also support our Patreon. If you like this show, if you like the Fifth Trooper show, if you like any of the blog stuff we write, please consider supporting us on Patreon. So, all right, let's hit the news.
Welcome to In the News.
So last week we talked about some Prime Championships in Australia.
Correct.
I understand you got a little update on that there, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a huge update, but so these primes, it turns out, are the remnants of canceled primes from last year. And so they are basically like they have world invites in the packs and stuff, so I think it's totally legit. I mean, what it isn't is it is not the precursor to a new Prime season, which is important and relevant. But it's good that people are actively playing and getting invites to Worlds whenever that ends up being, whether it be this year or 2025. So that's, I mean, it's good that people are getting Legion back on the table. So good on Australia. I hope everybody does well. Clearly only one person can win, but I'm sure everybody will have a great time. So, yeah.
Yeah, just to be playing in-person Legion right now is a huge win.
I also saw some pictures on Facebook from an Australian store, whether it's one that's holding this Prime or not, and they got a big restock of Phase 2s, it looked like, along with some other product. So, I mean, if this Prime, I know there's one that was played, and I think there's another one coming up. And so, I mean, people might be able to get units that they weren't, getting. I think there was AATs. I saw some Anakins and Mauls in there. Obviously, those won't be legal, but they were on the shelf, and they might not be for sale. I'm not saying they're for sale, but I'm just saying they got a big stock order. Whatever store that was, big stock order, which is good, especially if they're playing in person again out there. Like that's like really big.
Turns out that was just Australia's first shipment. Like it took that long to get the first shipment of Phase 2.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it kind of feels like that. I'm not gonna lie. Maybe they were like, oh, let's just hold off from Maul and Anakin and send them all at once, and it was like the greater plan. We didn't know about it, but yeah, it's good to see that if you weren't able to get your hands on those products and you have this Prime coming up, you're good to go. I think I might have even seen B2s in there too.
Yeah, there definitely was some B2s in there.
Yeah, I like scanned it quickly and I was like, wow, it's a pretty good stock update.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that, like, now that I'm, like, running some of the stock at the store and stuff, like, it also makes sense to, like, wait until you have, like, a reasonably large quantity to order at the same time to, like, save on shipping and stuff. And I imagine that's a huge deal when we're talking about shipping to Australia.
Yeah, I would say it's even more complicated with what's going on in the world too, because like, not to like get crazy, but like if they're trying to contain what's going on their island and the stuff's coming in, they got to make sure it's good. You know what I mean? So it's got to be a longer process than it was before. And we all know it was a long process then.
They just dunk the shipping container in bleach. They just like, take a big vat of bleach. They just dunk the whole thing, take it out, ship it. It's all in plastic wrap. Like, what's the big deal?
Oh, man.
Water
on that
damage.
Note. Yeah. Water damage. There you go.
Yeah.
How about we move on to our main topic?
Get ready for advanced tactics.
So our main topic today is we're going to continue our Objective 101 series and talk today about Payload. Payload, of course, being the Team Fortress style pushing a cart objective. Leads to a lot of dynamic play and interesting interactions, or toilet bowling, depending on how you set up the objectives. So what do you guys think? What do you think of this objective and how do you approach it?
Oh, what's a good way to start? Well, you need to be comfortable with moving. That's the primary thing. And you have to have a plan for where you drop the box. You basically have to think about really hard where you put your objective down, or your cart down first, because you put the carts down and then your opponent gets to pick what piece of terrain you got to drive the cart to. And deployment is really important on this, because there are some deployments that are really good for this and some that are really, really bad, depending on if you're red or blue. The ones that are really, really bad are like hemmed in, where you can basically start the payload in the middle of the map. And it's a pretty short hop to anywhere for blue. And then depending on where red puts theirs down, blue can just put the token for red on either side of that triangle and force red to travel a very, very long way by comparison. And that's important because payload, the amount of points you score is based on how close you get to that target. So it's either range 2 for 1 point, range 1 for 2 points, or base contact for 3. And like the biggest consideration, I think, first of all, is it reasonable for me to expect to get my payload close, or can I even score? Right? There's some situations like on Disarray where it's just too dang long, depending on what terrain's in the way, where you have to go. So like, is it better for me to try to freeze my opponent's payload by aggressively contesting it, that is pushing all my unit leaders onto the payload to stop their cart from moving? Or is it a better idea to try to escort mine and play more defensively and move it in a safer fashion? And there are lots of situations, and it's really important to measure here, because there are some situations where even having your cart stopped once can be the loss, because that one move is slightly longer than range 1. It's almost 7 inches. So one move with the cart, or the absence of one move with the cart, puts you down a VP. So it's really important to be able to know how many moves it will take you, how many unit leaders are eligible to actually influence it in a given turn. There's a lot of angles at work here. And that doesn't even approach cover being granted by the payload itself, and how that can change the battlefield as the turns progress, because the payload is a heavy cover source. And so that moves along, the battlefield changes. And there's situations where if your payload moves, you're suddenly, in the breeze, and you got to be aware of that. Right. Yeah, that's the basic rundown. It's a lot of ground to cover, but that's like kind of the top of mind issues for me when I address payload.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably this may be the most complicated objective to play in Legion, possibly.
Yeah.
So I think that there's two kind of frames of mind that you can start off the game playing. Similarly to like playing aggressively on VAPS, or and like separating your VAPS as far as possible, or trying to put them close together to create kind of a scrum, you can influence the payload lines to converge or diverge. And often one player is going to want them to diverge and the other player is going to want to have them converge. And so I think starting at turn 0, like the game can play out very differently depending on where the lines of the payloads actually cross, right? That, kind of crossing point is pretty much the bullseye for where the battle is going to take place, right? And if there's no bullseye, Kyle, you mentioned kind of like circling the wagons, right? It kind of turns into a more like old school breakthrough game where, it's 2 ships passing in at the night, kind of like firing off like a cannonade to see who can do more damage. But I think maybe more importantly than the converge diverge situation, and David, you touched on this with hemmed in, is that asymmetrical deployment zones really, I don't want to say screw up, but they really change how this objective works, right? And asymmetric deployment zones in how we talk about this objective specifically is a little bit more than just, oh, I'm blue on hemmed in and you're red on hemmed in. It can be something like, if somebody has a specific, like a terrain advantage as far as like where they can put their, the payload objective that is significantly farther away than the other person can put it, things can get a little complicated in that fashion. And so you really, I think the strongest advice I can give anybody before the game even starts is that if you don't know how to play payload and the game matters, you should ban it. Because if there's an objective you're going to screw up in turn 0, this is it. Like, this is the objective that there's the most variables. It is most complicated to just lose the game before it even starts. And so I would say that if you're getting ready for a tournament, and you either have, regardless of if you have payload in your deck or not, I think it's good to get a bunch of payload reps in and understand how the objective works, and clearly listen to the rest of what we're going to say. But, I think in this situation, like there's not a lot that's going to replace just getting reps in, because you're not going to see the things that matter until you realize how they screwed you.
Yeah, I mean, to speak off of what you're saying here, is an example is my Yavin base list with triple Mandos. I brought VAPS in that list because I was familiar with it, but honestly, that list probably would be better with payload. But I've played a total of 3 games of payload. I understand this game quite a bit, and I feel like I could play a payload game and be fine, but I'm not comfortable enough with it to put it in a deck where a win matters, right? And I'm understanding of that. Like, I'm not trying to put myself in a situation where I can be like, well, payload's better for this deck. I don't have the reps in it, but I'm smart. I can play around that. No, I'm smart enough to be like, I'm cutting this card from my deck because I don't have the reps to feel comfortable to play it. And I think that's important. Getting reps in now is tough. Obviously, like in real life, games are hard to come by, and you got to play Tabletop Simulator, and that's where majority of the reps are right now, right? And if I'm playing mostly important games on Tabletop Simulator and I'm cutting payload, I'm getting no payload reps in. Whereas a local game night, I'll throw it in my deck just to practice it, right? Because there's nothing on the line. So my payload experience is very low, which is fine. I just need to find ways to get reps in with it to feel comfortable to put in the deck. The thing about payload in from a competitive standpoint, and Mike, you alluded to a lot of these things, is it's got a lot of variables. I don't like variables when playing competitive Legion. I mean, it's a fun objective. I think it's meant to be fun. I don't think it's meant to be like this competitive like limp, right? It's not supposed to be like VAPS, where VAPS is ultra competitive and when in a competitive setting, and it creates sometimes it can create not a negative play experience, but a play experience where everyone's passing and like you said, the ships are circling each other. Payload, you can basically, where you put your payload and where you put your opponent's token, you can make it a fun game, quote unquote fun game, right? By determining where the battlefield's going to happen, like you said, where the lines are going to cross. So I think Payload is meant to basically engage and to not create a play experience where you're both going to opposite sides of the corner of the board, right? I think it's meant to be a game that is competitive and fun. But the issue is, and as you learn to play this game, if you're playing it competitively, mistakes and variables are not things you want in a game of Legion. It's basically the sports analogy that I always say it's a sports analogy because I played sports my whole life, and I approach Legion the same way. And I played hockey my whole life, and hockey is very similar in this way. And I probably have said it on this cast a million times, and I'm going to probably say it again. I'm a broken record. It's fine. The first team to make a mistake usually ends up losing a big game, especially when skill level or lists are the same. If the skill level and the lists are on the equal playing field, the first person to make that mistake is most likely going to lose that game, other than like a crazy play or some luck falling away. I'm not saying it's over when you make a mistake, but it basically goes from like an evil level to just real fast, right? And Payload can basically create that very early on, more than other games, other objectives in this game. So I know, Mike, like you said, turn 0 basically determines the game. And it does for a lot of matchups, don't get me wrong. But I would say it determines it more so on Payload than any other game, which I believe you said. So I'm just resonating the same thing that you're saying because I feel the exact same way.
Yeah, it's an objective that is designed to create conflict specifically, right? You have the objectives are not fixed. They're not in one place. And if you want, even if your opponent doesn't want this, you can usually set it up such that they're moving towards each other. So, it's sort of rare in that there's not a clear like attacker defender role in Payload. You're kind of both attackers by default.
Yep.
Almost every other objective has some kind of attacker defender dynamic, even like recover the supplies, where you have a box in the middle. That's the up for grabs victory point. Blue still starts in a position where they don't have to grab that middle box. Because if it's 2-2 on objectives and nobody kills anything and nobody grabs the middle box, then blue player wins. So even on like recover the supplies where there's a common objective in the middle, blue player has a slight, starts with a slight advantage there, and that the pressure is on red to get that box. But that's not the case with Payload. The pressure with Payload is on both players to move their own payload to the enemy deployment zone. Because even like one turn of not moving a payload can really cost you.
Yeah, so like I was going to say, there's an interesting dynamic, right? Because like you say, Kyle, it's not clear who both players are kind of the attacker, right? It's not clear who can be the as you like to say, beat down and control, right? So who can have the edge? And I think the answer is who can fight in a more direct way is probably going to be the one that wins. If you're like an army that relies on distance, you're probably not going to be happy when those payloads cross paths, because you have to stand near this object to score something. So in a way, it's like intercept, right? Except that the thing is moving constantly. And so you need to be comfortable getting in someone's face. Durable armies can do that. Armies like Palpatine are probably pretty good at payloads that cross, because at some point your opponent is going to stand unit leaders in a spot and Palpatine just needs to be range 2 at that spot, and then it's on, right? Lightning all over the place. The other part is that it's also that this objective is it's a moving piece that doesn't belong to your army, right? It's not able to be attacked. It's only able to be stopped by contesting from your opponent or deflected by positioning of terrain and the bases of large vehicles. Now, that's only if the payload lands on it. You only restrict where the payload can land. It can't land on vehicles, if I'm not mistaken. It can displace when it lands, but it's only things that can be displaced. Everything else, it can't land on it, if I'm not mistaken, but it can fly over it. Its movement is not really defined. But it's closest, I think, to a repulsor vehicle, if I'm not mistaken. It kind of moves like a repulsor in that it flies over terrain and flies over objects.
And it's sort of I don't know, like you can block this with a melee, and things
also true.
And things of that nature, right? Like there are some janky ways to I shouldn't say janky. There are some creative ways.
Yes, better word.
Jank generally implies a negative connotation, so I'm not.
Yeah, creative. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some creative ways to get your opponent's bomb cart to not move, and I mean, vehicles are particularly good at that. If you drop like a tank in front of their bomb cart, like it's not really going anywhere, right?
Recently casted a game where the Saber tank blocked the payload, and that actually resulted in a no-score game.
Yeah, the
payload couldn't advance, and then the player down on points, payload couldn't advance, and then the other player his payload was blocked because of contesting. So they were just stuck, and then it suddenly became a points game where both payloads were completely bogged down by the action on the board. And so the game suddenly pivoted really sharply away from objectives. Like it was like we're going for objectives right up until turn 6, where it became evident that the board state wouldn't allow either player to score. And so then the game immediately shifted into kill point mode, and people were like doing all the counting like mad.
I do think that this objective overall, like you have to have like I shouldn't say super specific, but your army does need to be kind of built for this. You can't just like throw payload in your battle deck and have it be fine, like VAPS or breakthrough or something.
Right.
Positions.
Yeah, it's just you can't do that. Like you've got to be able to have unit leaders that not only can contest the objective, but potentially contest your opponents, which often tends to be the same thing in payload. Like when it matters, a lot of the unit leaders in the game are contesting both payloads a lot of the time. Like there's like generally like 1 to 2 turns that are like the pivotal turns in the payload game where they combine, and whoever wins that scrum, their payload moves and the other payload doesn't. And that's kind of, a lot of times that can be the game. And like armies that can move and shoot and don't rely on aim tokens are much better at this than armies that want to just like sit on their heels and kind of do nothing and wait for you to come to them. Clones are obviously very good at this. I think shore troopers are actually pretty good at this because they can pick up that aim token, move, and then shoot with target, right? Iden, ISF, great. Frankly, anything with the infiltrate keyword to kind of like set up that bulwark ahead of where your payload's going to be. You can kind of build a pocket. I think Tawns, because they kind of contain your opponent, tend to be pretty good at an objective like this. The Tawn list can sometimes run into like issues with, oh man, they scoped, they didn't scope, but they just like shred the rebel troopers behind the Tawns, and things can kind of go south if they're not careful. But I think generally speaking, Tawns are pretty good at this objective. I don't know. Those are the lists that come top of head and top of mind that I think stick out to me that are particularly good.
I think droids are good at payload because of the massive bodies that they can put on the payload. Which I just think droids are all around good anyways. I mean, Kyle, you play droids, you probably know. But like, even so, like, all right, let's put it this way. Kyle, you probably bring Payload in your deck, if I had to take a guess, with your Dooku stats list, because you have a sheer mass of bodies that can insulate your Payload. Dooku can absolutely shred your opponent's Payload when it matters, and your Staps can also flank their Payload and cause mayhem on the backside. Like if you take them as a flanking unit, which I'm sure you use them in that list for that reason, you flank them and they hit your opponent's Payload while you just have droid insulation on yours. So I have to say, like when I see Payload or key positions when I'm playing against droids, I dread it because they're so hard to figure out on those two objectives. But since we're talking about Payload, they're hard to figure out on Payload because you need to figure out early on if you want to engage by killing the droids and trying to take away unit leaders with them, or trying to insulate your own Payload and make the droids make the mistake of like overextending and then taking the droids out. Like you have to like kind of time it right when you're playing against them is how I feel about it. Because if you do that timing in the wrong way, those droids are now also going to just overtake your Payload while moving their own Payload. And like we said, when your Payload doesn't move and theirs is moving, you're in trouble.
Run Payload in my Separatist list primarily because of Dooku. Not necessarily because of the B1s. B1s are good at a lot of objectives like that because they can swamp them. It's not necessarily just unique to Payload. We were discussing before the cast, ironically, the only game I've lost with Dooku was Payload. So
you screwed that game up, though.
I know. I am fully aware.
It should be noted that Separatists have Dooku, Grievous, and Maul, who are all arguably really good at this kind of objective. Dooku,
tanks too.
Yeah, well, tanks too, right? So Dooku has, his great command cards in Cunning, which are great to like intercept the other Payload. Grievous has the Whirlwind, which is also good at like removing things on the Payload. I know sometimes it can whiff, but it's still like a really good card for this kind of situation when you're converging on each other. And Maul is a red saving, infiltrating Sith user with Force Choke and Force Push. Like those are, and that's why like I know I keep alluding to like B1s and staffs and stuff like that. The thing is that you can insulate your Payload with those B1s and not have to worry about it because you have those powerful units that can back up, and you have to list build around them anyways because that's what you have, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of what you're saying, Zach, I mean, Force users are this may be the best objective for Force users in the game. I think potentially, I'm not sure that we could have a conversation about that, but I think it's close if it's not. But I think kind of to speak to the droid issues here, I think it kind of speaks to Payload specifically. Like lists that don't throw a lot of raw dice don't like playing droids, generally.
Rebels.
Yeah,
I shouldn't say that.
Rebels. I mean,
modern rebels.
Rebels.
No, but it's true.
Rebels tend to throw like high quality dice pools that are low in volume now. That's kind of their thing, right?
It's like 2 or 3, but it can get something through that cover pretty reliably.
Right, Pierce, high velocity, sharpshooter, blast,
critical like one.
4 red dice on tawns or the tawn with charge, None of those pools are extraordinarily huge unless you've got like a tenacity tawn or you've got like operative Luke with tenacity on him, right? Or at least their large pools are not terribly consistent.
You should give Flamer RTs an extra health.
Yeah.
That would actually be pretty tight.
I mean, there are definitely units in the Rebel arsenal that can do those things, but they're not as consistently good as the other things, right? But I think more to the point in where we're talking about Payload is that if you're gonna play Payload, it's going to be a gunfight. It's going to be a range 3 gunfight at some point, and generally whoever has more guns or more raw dice after cover is going to just win that fight. a lot of the time. It's clearly a little bit more complicated than that when you get like force users involved and stuff, but like a good rule of thumb is like you don't want to play payload if you think the opponent outguns you. Like you should just get rid of it, because you're going to get into the fight where everybody's shooting at the same time, and if you feel like you're going to lose that fight traditionally, if you're looking at the table and thinking, okay, well, I really need like something like moisture VAPS where like I can shave off an activation because it was misplaced or something and turn the tables, like you should be avoiding payload. I
was going to say it's amplified also by the fact that every unit type is eligible to push the cart. So you can really get your whole army involved. It doesn't have to be just troopers or just a certain section of the army. They can all push. And if you ball up really tight, like CIS or clones are really good at, they gain a lot from balling up like that. Really makes it ideal. Of course, that makes you vulnerable to area of effect attacks, which we sort of covered by talking about Grievous, but explosions or Now You Will Die or any of those other close range nukes that have multi-target, you can make yourself vulnerable to that. And heck, even just a Jedi, right? If you ball up all together and you're all close enough, the Jedi can do the whole, swing, grab another, swing, grab another kind of thing they do with force push. And going back to something we talked about a little bit ago, Dooku Maul, on a Dooku's 3-pip turn, you could potentially nix 5 unit leaders. Like, it's not unheard of. You shove one with the command card effect, you force push, choke off Dooku, and then Maul force pushes and chokes another 2. So that's at maximum you could potentially push 3 leaders out or 5 leaders out.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, it's one of the theoretical maximums, but it's not, you can't dismiss that when you're fighting a list like that.
No, and I do think that like if you're in like one of the later turns of the game, that scenario is like much more likely than if you did it on turn like 3 or 4, right?
Certainly, yeah.
When there's like random unit leaders running around and stuff, I think you're probably going to average like 3.5 units with that combo.
Right.
Probably.
That sounds more like a key positions magical Christmas land more than a payload one.
but still, you have to brook it. It's like that 1% that can still happen and steal a game away.
Well, I think maybe to your point, David, like, to have that in your back pocket is very powerful, right?
Yeah.
Like, just being able to have access to 3 force push effects in a turn is really good,
and one of them is a speed too.
Right.
Yeah, one of them comes at speed 2.
Like, it's Vader's Might gives you 2, right?
Right, exactly.
And Operative Vader / Commander Vader is like not super good, but that card is hella good. It's just like, oh, I get to do whatever I want this turn. And and if you save it for the last turn, similarly to like what you're talking about is super powerful.
Right.
If you go last with Dooku, or like second to last, force push 2 things basically, and then force push something else with Maul, like you can go up by 3 without swinging a lightsaber, without doing any damage, right? Yep. And
all you need are the positional effects.
Exactly. And that's pretty huge.
Yeah, that's another thing about those cards is that they have no random element. They're just do this, and that's really like the cool part about the game is people like to complain about dice results and things like that, but there are tons of elements of the game that are non-random, and positioning is one of those things. That's the skill element there, and knowing that your opponent can do certain moves is also a skill element.
Did we actually talk about randomization last week, or is that something we just like talked about in chat? I don't remember.
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know.
So the short answer is no. We have done an episode. I think it was one of our very first episodes. So maybe we need to revisit this topic, but basically about managing risk and reducing variance. So we could probably revisit that topic. That was actually like one of the very first articles I ever wrote.
Yeah, no, totally. And David, like you brought up the fact that like force push is like, it just happens, right? And that's something we don't talk a lot about. Like a lot of times we're like, oh, force push is really good, you should never leave home without it, right? One of the main reasons for that is like you can't Like it just happens.
It can't whiff.
Right, you can never whiff with force. I mean, unless you're dead.
I mean, unless you are not in range. Right. But if you're in range, you're gonna get it.
Right, you know when you're gonna be able to use it. It's not like you wound up a saber shot with Luke and just totally whiffed and like you're out now, right?
Oh yeah.
And so like
whiffing with Luke is terrible. By the way, it's happening.
It happens too.
It is. All right. Not to like go on a tangent real quick. That is arguably one of the worst feelings in like the history of Star Wars Legion is when you whiff with Luke Skywalker.
I know, of all people.
I mean,
it seems like it happens with him the most. Commander Luke specifically. Jedi Luke doesn't really whiff, but those 6 black dice, don't get me wrong, they can be amazing. But I've definitely had games where I'm like, I just need one hit to kill this guy, and then I roll all blanks on 6 black dice. I'm like, oh.
I think that's how Luke probably felt on Bespin too.
I know. I was actually just thinking of that scene. I was like, man, that's the scene where he nicks Vader on the shoulder, and then Vader just like kicks his ass.
Yeah, I mean, it just like I think it makes sense.
He's untrained.
Yeah.
So we've kind of already started doing this, but let's like segue to what lists and what units are good at payload and which ones are not.
Well, I mean, the obvious one is clones of any stripe, really. I don't mean that ironically. I mean that literally. They're super good at it.
They are.
Stand by sharing notwithstanding.
But I would like to point out that phase 1s are significantly worse at this objective than phase 2s.
Accurate.
Because it is far less like phase 2s, like it feels like they're never suppressed, but if you're not taking Courage 2 core units and clones, like there's actually not a lot of suppression management within the clone shell, right? Which I think is why phase 2s are so prevalent to some degree, which again, conversation for another time. But I do think if there's phase 1s on the other side of the board, I think it's much more manageable.
Yeah, high save, like high body count, high save is just really good. And like even higher body count, no save is also really good.
I think
for different reasons.
I think it's basically any list that feels confident in a gun line and also has a centerpiece that could also flip the game on its head. Like, I'm not saying like, so if you look at like a list like Iden Shores, I know Infiltrate's really good for payload, and I know that Tac Strike is also a really good card. But there's like a little, like if you're running like the variant that has the 3 mortars, I don't know if you want payload. Basically, the reason why I say that is because you have 3 activations of mortars that are either going to be a liability or they're not going to be moving. And I know that you have all the other activations that can handle it. I get that. But like as soon as you lose one of those mobile activations, let's say you lose an ISF squad, right? You now have 3 mortars that if they want to move, they're going to get killed because they're only 3 health, right? Or they're hanging back so they don't die and they're not moving with the payload. So your flexibility with your units that can mobilize with it is kind of hard. Whereas let's say you're bringing like I know we talked about clones, but let's say you bring like a clone list with like Obi-Wan or a Saber tank, and it's built around being a gun line with a centerpiece. I feel like you feel probably more in command than you would a list that doesn't have that gun line and a centerpiece, which circles around to force users. But I wanted to mention like the Saber tank and like the AAT. And I think, Mike, you mentioned tanks when I was talking about, droids. Like Saber tank and AAT are really good at this objective because they aid the gun line by being really strong, long-ranged units that are beefy defensively. But man, have you ever seen that base move? It moves. So like if you need those tanks to start moving up to move your payload, they can get there really quickly and also shoot you in your face because like of the range aspect and how fast they can move along the battle.
You can just strafe.
I think, yes. I mean, yeah, strafe is unbelievable. If you haven't strafed with one of those vehicles and when you finally get like a strafe that means something, you realize how good strafe actually is. I think the conversation about what lists are good with payload is also a little bit diluted and what I mean by that is the majority of us play on Tabletop Simulator right now because of what's going on in the world, and the maps are a known quantity. If you're showing up to a tournament tomorrow and you don't know what your terrain is looking like, a list that actually wants payload might not bring payload. That's a topic for another discussion, but like maps mean a whole lot in payload. Where you place your payload, how your payload moves, where the area that it's moving around. There are lists that literally you could look at and be like, oh, that is a great list for payload. And then you look up and you see the map and you're like, I don't want to bring payload. It's kind of it's interesting. I think there's a lot of lists that actually want to bring payload, but it circles back to something that we started at, and it's something that I have personally. I have little experience with it. I won't bring it when it matters. So it's important to get those reps in because I do think a lot of lists actually like payload.
And just as far as the terrain aspect is concerned, I actually, as someone that tends to run like a force using centerpiece plus a gun line, I actually like that you have some control over where the battle's going to happen. So when you're playing any sort of force user, line of sight blockers and their location is always an extremely important thing to evaluate when you're looking at a table. And most objectives, the action takes place near the center, right? So if you have a line of sight blocker near the center and you have Dooku or Palpatine or Vader or Luke or Obi-Wan, you're feeling pretty good about it. But if the objective is near the center and there's no line of sight blockers there, you're feeling a lot less good about bringing that force user. But with payload, you have some control over where that battle is going to happen. And it's pretty unusual for a table to have like no line of sight blockers on it. Don't get me wrong. I've seen some tables like that. And if that happens, you're in trouble anyway. But usually there's going to be somewhere. And with payload, you have some control over like where those paths are going to converge. So just for me personally, like if you have a force user, you can control to some degree where that is, and you want to force your opponent's payload to go past a line of sight blocker, ideally. And you can usually set that up, even if there's not ones in the center.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that we tend to talk about vehicles in that they aren't super viably competitive. I think this is one of the two objectives, bombing run being the other, where vehicles are actually much more viable than we would like consider them traditionally. Vehicles can do a number of things on this objective. We've already talked about blocking it and stuff like that, but I do think that any list that has like a pretty mobile vehicle with armor that has like high wounds is like worth talking about payload. Like an ATST is like actually pretty good at payload, I think. It can kind of just walk right up there with it, open up, like it's gonna scare your opponent's units out of like away from the path you're kind of trending towards. You probably still want to bring like a repair bot or R2D2 if you're like in a rebel, or rebels don't really have a heavy that works super well with payload. I mean, they don't. Accurate. Like their heavies are much more glass cannons, right? Like,
yes.
That's kind of like the rebel thing is they're very like Eldar glass cannon-y. They hit and run, they shoot and scoot, like that's their thing. But I do think that like all the other factions like have a heavy that's like boom, like this is escorting the payload. You probably have to kill it anyways, so I might as well murder most of your army with it. The Sabers probably, we've touched on the Saber already, but I do think that this is an objective where some vehicles are actively good, and I think it's important to stress that. And I also think that, like, while rebels may not have a vehicle that works in the same way as like a Saber tank or an ATST or an AAT, like if you time your airspeeder attack well, like you can displace a bunch of important units, or like come in on a last activation and like completely block their bombing run, and then like just scoot out on the first activation. And like that's actually like very powerful and relevant, you know, when you can just be like, okay, I'm gonna move and just block your payload, right? And with this thing that was like, I don't know how far an airspeeder triple move is, but it's got to be.
Geez, it's got to be a lot, because it's what, speed 3 on a big base?
It's about 30 inches.
Yeah, right. Roughly. So we're talking like almost 3 feet. You know, you can be like 3 feet away from something and just be like, boom, now your payload can't move, right? And like, you're not going to be able to do that every time, but if you set it up correctly, and this is kind of where like the planning comes into the payload thing, is you have to plan that in advance, right? You got to know where their payload's going to be. You got to make sure your airspeeder can get there. You got to make sure your orders are right on the right turn. It's not impossible, but it's definitely like, it's a thing that can happen. And I mean, you could do that with any vehicle. I'm using the airspeeder as an example because it's probably the best at being flexibly fast, and at least doesn't immediately die if it gets like attacked in the open. Like you could do it with staps, but like they're just gonna get immediately shredded, right? Like, you know, at least an airspeeder is not, if it's a full health, like it's probably not gonna die to one attack unless you're playing against clones or something when they've got a bunch of aim tokens. So that's just something to consider. Vehicle players out there, rejoice and put payload in your decks. Yeah. You know,
and even if you can't even if you can't freeze the payload, if you put that base in front of it, you can cause it to deflect. And even that small deflection away from the shortest path, that can cause a win over like a couple turns. So don't be afraid to just put it in there and try to prevent that payload from moving forward. Just get it in the mix and see what you can do with it. It might be a little scary if your opponent has a Saber user. Obviously, Saber user is really good. They like it when vehicles drive up close because it makes it really easy to kill them. But especially the Occupier, oh my gosh. Don't get me started on how hard Luke Sabine wrecks the Occupier. It's unbelievable. So yeah, just be aware of that at least. But yeah, AATs right on, strafe away, shoot everything up, and try to get in there and get your opponent off course. It can actually make their army walk somewhere that's not great for them. And then you get like this sort of pile-on effect over a course of turns, where your opponent is forced further and further away from where their army would ideally like to stand to get cover. And that just makes it easier for your vehicle to shoot them down, because vehicles hate things in cover.
It's also worth noting, you know, we've talked about payload devolving into a gunfight, right? And a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, if you like put your vehicle somewhere where it's going to deflect or completely stop their payload, they have to shoot it. Like, they don't have a choice, or they're just going to lose the game, which a lot of the time can free up your other units to actually go ham and just open up kind of willy-nilly. You can take the aim shoot actions or whatever that you need to kind of grind out your opponent's battle line. A lot of times you'll be trading out when you do that, right? You should expect to lose the vehicle. Like, I think anytime you put a vehicle, regardless if it's a Saber or an AAT, in front of your opponent's army and say, shoot this with everything, it probably, you should expect it to die even if it doesn't. Like, an AAT can sometimes get through an entire turn of shooting and be okay. But a lot of times you can trade out well, specifically on this objective, I think. If you've got firepower behind it. Now, if you took some like crazy list where it's just a heavy and a bunch of naked rebel troopers or naked stormtroopers, that's probably less of a good idea. But if you actually took a gun line behind it, I think it's actually tenable.
And sometimes you could even trade your vehicle for the win. Because if that vehicle stops the payload and your opponent doesn't score that VP, you just win the game by sacrificing your heavy.
Right, and that's why they have to shoot it, right? Like, right, exactly. You know, there's no, if they've correctly identified the situation. If they haven't, you've already won, probably.
Yeah, you've already won. Yours there.
Yeah, just by virtue of being one of the handful of objectives that vehicles can actually explicitly score. I think basically if you have vehicles in your list, you should just take payload and not think twice about it.
Yeah, you would take payload. You'd probably swap out evaporators. You'd definitely like breakthrough payload.
Depends.
Key positions.
No, I think
some vehicles are pretty good at VAPS.
Yeah.
Really? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, you can alpha strike on VAPS.
Well, it's not even that. It's you have a long range option that can whittle your opponent away, and they can't whittle you back because they don't have the range power to kind of like to like get at it. It depends on what. It depends on the matchup. Yeah, like
I think you still mostly want VAPS though.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a controlled variable. I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, AATs are really good at sniping activations.
If they ever
AATSDs are too.
Nerf arc strike teams, I will totally get behind vehicles taking VAPS. Until then.
Oh yeah, arc strikes still shred vehicles of all shapes and sizes.
If you can't hide your vehicle and you're playing against arc strikes,
it's a liability.
You should just, whether you're blue or red, you're red. You should just resign yourself to that at the beginning of the game.
Yeah, but the thing about that is you can't not take an objective over one unit. That's the thing. Like, it's still going to be viably good against everything else except for that one unit.
So I don't want to get super far down this rabbit hole. I think that generally that's right. I think it's a little bit different when we're talking about the thing that's you're dying to is the best unit in the game. Right?
I was going to say it depends on the prevalence, right?
But well, the thing about that, right, is that we are always talking about the magical Christmas land that is Tabletop Simulator that allows you to play triple arcs, whereas you go to an actual tournament right now, you might not have triple arcs because they were hard to come by. Like, we're not dealing with the physical aspect that could actually change that. So like it's something hard to quantify because we're living, like, our actual meta is revolving around being able to play all those arc troopers, whereas it might not be the case if we were playing in real life right now.
Yeah, but you can't make strategic choices based on stocking issues.
Potential
stocking issues. Because some dude's gonna, like, if somehow we had Adepticon tomorrow, like, some dude is going to be able to buy 3 arcs, and you need to have a plan for that situation.
Well, not only that, but like,
and
if
I agree with that.
Adepticon was tomorrow, like 70% of the field would probably be playing. That might be a little high, but like,
that's high.
Like,
that's high.
I think that we would all expect the majority, the highest portion of the field to be clones, right?
I still don't think you can base your battle deck as an AAT player, let's say, right, as an example. I still don't think you base your deck off one unit, regardless of how prevalent they might be.
So I want to focus this back on payload a little bit, because we've had this discussion, not specifically about arcs necessarily, but just about like anticipating a meta and building
shores
a list for that meta. Yeah, probably
shores.
That is a whole separate discussion. The short version is you should try and figure out what people are going to bring and what's going to be successful, and make sure you have a plan for whatever that thing is. Right now, that thing is Rex Star or Arc Star clone lists. By the time we have an actual real big convention tournament, which is the environment that you really need to care about this for, I don't think this is as big of a discussion for like primes where you're only playing 3 to 4 games. That may be totally different, but bottom line is you need to figure out what you think the meta is going to be, what you think the lists to beat are going to be, and you do need to make decisions around those lists specifically.
Now you see, Zach, I'm an expert at losing strike teams, so I
can attest to this.
Yeah, I know. It's actually happened to me twice now at major tournaments. One game I recovered from, one game I didn't. But the trick, of course, is flying playing advanced positions and deploying your AAT where you can see both arc minis, and praying they don't have surges. That's the trick.
Yeah, I mean, vehicles are good at eliminating activations, but Mike has a good point in that currently,
only 2 wounds.
Right. In that, it's a lot of points. It's something that's basically impossible to hide. And in a world where you have a range 5 aim shearing weapon with critical and lethal, it's kind of a liability.
Yeah, I mean,
like you have to anticipate over the course of 6 turns that you're going to lose that vehicle if you do nothing but sit on your hands and defend.
I mean, it is not unreasonable for arc strikes like by themselves to kill any tank in like 3 turns with the right amount of aim tokens. Like it's just it's something. I mean, they're really good at a lot of things, but like, taking a 160 point tank off the table is a thing. And so I think we're like super off the rails on the payload thing at this point, but I mean, sometimes your payload comes off the rails, and that's kind of how the game goes, right?
I mean, they're still good at payload though.
They are, and I don't think that like you should play every game, just expecting to lose, but I do think that like when you sit down across the table from somebody on turn 0, I think that you need to start making decisions based on the list. And one of those decisions is like, I don't want to be playing X against, in this situation, right?
Well, and I've definitely had situations like the one where you described where we've ended up on VAPS and I'm blue player. But after deployment, I'm like, before any dice are rolled, I'm like, I'm red player, essentially. I have to attack because I'm guaranteed to lose a unit.
Right, and it's not a great feeling.
No, that's a problem I have with like the FD turret. I played an FD in what was that, season 3, season 4? What season are we on for Invader?
I think we're going into 6.
Going into 6.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it was 4. The one I ran Jedi Luke. I played an FD, which was great, but also like on Vaporators, that thing is a straight liability because you cannot retreat it. So there were several VAPS games where I'm starting the game and I'm like, at some point over the course of 6 turns, this FD cannon is going to die. And I cannot just defend. I need to contest the VAP, basically from turn 1. And I think the same can be said of heavy vehicles when you're facing basically anything you can't hide when you're facing arc snipers, or possibly like an Iden tactical strike list also comes to mind. So way off topic.
Well, I mean, you might as well, while we're off topic, you might as well call the FD turret the SD turret when you're playing a Vaporator game like that, as it's a sitting duck.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, they're good at defense, but the fact that, at least to me personally, the way that I play, not being able to retreat a unit feels really bad.
Yeah.
I feel like you should just have the option to just delete an FD turret yourself. And your opponent doesn't get the points. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, like, that's not how the game works. I mean,
I know.
This is an Age of Empires. You can delete a building,
right?
I do think that, kind of maybe segueing a little bit more into the payload discussion. I think that there are ways to play these units unconventionally. That make up for some of these like bad matchups, right? Like you can put an FD turret in the back of your deployment zone, right? It's not going to do much there, but it's much less of a liability if it's, your opponent has to like dive an extra range band or 2 to get to it, right? If all of a sudden their snipers have to be in the middle of the board to shoot your FD turret, it's clearly going to be a lot less offensively good, but you're still protecting your VAPs and you're still, doing stuff like that. I think the same thing can be said of vehicles, right? Like leave the vehicle in the back of the deployment zone if you're playing against, strike teams. Make them reach. Sniper reaches far, but it's not, it's not the infinite range that it used to be. God, if arc strikes were infinite range, man, that'd be real good. I have 3
I'm so
Cassians.
glad they're not. Without cumbersome.
Right. Yeah. And infinite aim tokens. But, I do think that there are ways to play a little unconventionally to mitigate some of these circumstances. And I think that when you're playing Payload, you need to sort of think like that. You need to start thinking a little bit more outside the box when it comes to dealing with objectives. I think once we do start putting stuff on real tables, like the vehicle meta, I mean, I'm sure that there are local metas that are different, but generally speaking, like the vehicle meta is not a huge thing overall, at least in the competitive community. But like somebody's going to show up to a competitive event with a saber tank and just block people's payloads all day and try and force payload, and it's gonna be great for them, you know. And so I think one of the things that I really like about these new objectives, payload included, is that they kind of change completely what units are good and how you play the game. Hostage is probably a little bit less so, but bombing run and payload are both like units that are not traditionally very good are actually pretty good at that objective.
So let's pivot real quick to one last thing about payload before we close this out, and that is essentially, how do you know when to like dive on your opponent's payload and contest it versus just kind of sitting back and trying to just conservatively push yours?
I think it depends on the wounds exchanged on the battle. And obviously it depends on what your list makeup is too. But like when the payloads, like when they're starting to really start cross paths and they're starting to get, you know, closer and closer, if you have basically dealt a lot of wounds to your opponent and their firepower to exchange back to you is way less, I feel like the opportunity for you to kind of go up and try and tie up their payload because you have the mass bodies behind you that they now lack because you whittled them down and they haven't whittled you back is something to be aware of. Vice versa now is that if you're being whittled down by your opponent and you're afraid that you're going to lose track of your payload, is that you might be able to also now engage your opponent in like melee and stop their payload and also be safe depending on when the timing is right. So I think it really ultimately boils down to, it is a fluid situation. I don't think there actually is a set in stone answer. It's a fluid situation on who has exchanged more wounds and what units are involved in doing so.
So I don't know. I think it's a complicated situation, but I also think that it's like very easy to overcomplicate. My stance on this is you move your payload, and then when your payloads cross, you tag their payload, and whoever wins that fight just wins. And like that battle occurs whenever the payloads cross. It can be a lot more complicated than that, and I think that the discussion really revolves around the victory point totals. Like, it may not even make sense to shave a move off your opponent's payload if you're good, right? Like it really depends on the situation. But I do think that more often than not, if the payloads are crossing, and they probably should be, as we've discussed in a payload game, like somebody should have made that decision for them to cross, or someone made a wrong decision, likely. Like there's just going to be a point where somebody's going to be able to basically tag both payloads at the same time. That feels sort of inevitable to me, and I don't really feel like you have a ton of control over when that happens. Like it's like and the reason I say that is because you can't really afford to like dilly-dally on your payload and like choose the timing of when this is going to happen. I mean, like clearly you can try and cross the lines, but like it's kind of awkward because you want the engagement to happen closer to you than to them, but if it happens closer to you than to them, their payload has moved farther, which is kind of not great, because that means that you're probably on turn like 3 or 4 on your side of the field and your payload still has a ways to go. But you can be like sitting in a more defensive position and kind of offensively taking care of their units. So I think that you really want to build a situation where you're meeting in the middle of the battlefield almost exactly. And when I say middle, not like dead center, but like middle of the paths and just hash it out. I think most payload games are determined right in the center of the board, and generally whoever wins that scrum takes both payloads much of the time.
So this might seem like a super basic question, but keeping in mind the timing of when payloads are dropped and then subsequently when terrain pieces are selected, where should you put your payload in your deployment zone?
Close to the center as possible, generally speaking.
I don't know if it's as simple as you think it is.
I mean, I think that's a good rule of thumb, is like maybe close to the center is not the right way, but like the closest place that touches everything your opponent controls, right? Like you know, which sometimes is the center, sometimes it's often the center, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of a scenario where it's not, and it's probably on like danger close.
Danger close is super awkward for payload. Yeah,
it can get a little weird. Maybe advanced positions. Maybe no. You're really just putting it in the crook of the L there. Yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. I could see it maybe on hemmed in if like there was some clear targets or whatever. But I think that's pretty close to it. Like, put it as close to your opponent's deployment zone as you can. You know.
Well, I think it's actually likely as close to the center of the table as possible, because, you know, like there are some weird deployments where your opponent could select a terrain piece that's not actually close to their own deployment zone, but it's just really far from your payload.
That's totally fair.
That's where the complication comes in, is not knowing where your opponent's going to put the token. And my complication, basically caveat, is it depends on list makeup. I think that there are lists that you'll see on the table, and you'll put a token somewhere where you'll enter the game thinking, oh, if I play payload, I'll put it over here, right? But then you see your opponent's list and you actually put it the complete opposite way, because you need to either force the engagement earlier than you would normally want, or delay the engagement more than you normally want. Like an example is I played against a double AAT list on payload, and logically speaking, without seeing your opponent's list and you have payload on the table, you put the payload center of the board and you go, and you're thinking you're going to go towards your opponent's deployment zone, right? Or you put your tokens in somewhat of the same area and you force the engagements to happen, even if your payload actually has to travel a longer distance. Because if you do put it in the spot that you think it's going to be in, you're now going to expose yourself and have no chance, is the way I felt in this matchup. Like if I juked left, I would get obliterated by the double AATs. Whereas if I juke right, I actually force the engagement to happen in an area that benefits me more. Now that's super, super game dependent. It's super list dependent. I'm not saying it's going to happen often, but it's going to happen where you're going to try and force an engagement, because if you don't, you'll end up in a situation that's bad, I think.
I mean, I think that part of this is kind of to circle back to the timing question. I think a lot of these turn zero choices in where you put your payload really speaks to, like, if you're going to make a decision on when you engage, you're making it on turn zero when you place your payload and you place the tokens that they're going to. Like,
yeah,
like
it's determined right then and there.
You don't get to choose when all of those things happen after turn zero. Like, they're going to happen at a predetermined time. Like, you're going to set things down and they're going to collide on turn 4 or turn 5 or whatever. And And so I think when you're talking about where you're putting, like, the closest to the center of the battlefield is the most flexible place for you to do that. It also affords you the most flexibility in timing, in that, you know, if you can delay and still make it to your payload point, that's the most reasonable place to put it to allow yourself like a dead turn. That's not super likely, especially if you've got an opponent that knows what they're doing. I mean, it's just like it's very difficult to delay intentionally and still win the game. But there are definitely situations where it's right.
I'd say as a general rule, you need to make a goal of pushing your payload every single turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally.
It has to.
I mean that's kind of like a, you know, like you're playing hemmed in and, you know, you were super close already. You know, like there are scenarios where maybe you can take a turn off, but you shouldn't count on it.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the edge cases whereas you can take a turn off is if your token's in a spot where it's easy for you to get there in less turns, or if you have an alternative win condition like secret mission or bounty that could aid you in, like, let's say you're pushing your payload and you go up in points with like a bounty hunter, right? And you say to yourself, well, if I just get to range, you know, the scoring range of 2 points rather than touching and getting 3 points, but I have this bounty, I can tie the game and essentially win, right? It's all going to come down to the basics of any other objective, which is counting and doing math and making sure that your win conditions are in place. There's just more variables to it than you're used to, kind of.
Yeah, I will say that probably less bounty, but secret mission is pretty clutch on payload. Payload often goes like 0-0, 1-1, and secret mission just steals the game, especially because like a lot of the time if you're like R2 is like out in, you know, the middle of a field 100 yards away from everybody, like your opponent really can't afford to take a unit out of their gun line when the fight happens, right? So
payload might be R2's best objective because you kind of have to, and maybe not in terms of how it affects the game, but what I mean is like his survivability goes up like exponentially, because if you know where the payload's going to go, you deploy him in a spot where you know the payload's not going to go, and your opponent has to make a decision to either separate from their payload to deal with R2 or just stay with the payload and deal with the consequences. And I think we saw that with Evan's game in Yavin Base, right? Is R2 won the game for Zeus Juice strictly because Evan couldn't stop the payload. Now, Evan tried to stop the payload. Like, he understood he needed to stop that payload to stop R2 from scoring to win the game. He was unable to stop that payload, and R2 won the game. But that was because R2 had a piece of the battlefield that he just kept on waltzing by. Because if Evan did break away from his payload, Luke Skywalker was going to come mess him up. So, like, the opportunity for R2 to score is probably higher on payload than any objective, I would think.
I mean,
especially you can force battle lines or disarray.
Totally.
Right? And disarray especially, because disarray is like has one of the highest no score payload potentials. Because I think it's the deployment setting with the smallest total area, which means it should have the longest paths possible. Because you can technically go from, let's say you go from like the closest to the mid, and then you just pick the opposite short edge to force your opponent to walk to. It's awful. You might actually break it so that you can't ever score.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there may be a question there on those two things should never be in the same battle deck.
I mean, you could just all in on secret mission.
You totally, you very well could, right? Like, you could.
It's true.
I mean, like, you could take like a double secret mission Republic list, right? And
totally.
kind of go in on that. And I think, you know, Padme is also very good on this objective generally. You know, She can hold her own a little bit better than Archie can. Clearly, she's a lot more points. She does a lot of other interesting things, but this is a situation where like on payload, sometimes you can like wait until you go last and then actually like infiltrate her into your opponent's deployment zone like really safely at the beginning of the game. Like I've done that before. Like if it's like advanced position something, you just like drop her behind a rock in your opponent's deployment zone and you're like, well, this is the game now.
Yeah, get a free VP. Nice.
And it just sits there. So just something to consider in that vein too. But I mean, clearly Bounty also can kind of do that to the game. It's just it's less consistent.
Controllable.
Yeah, it's less consistent, less controllable, right? Like your opponent has to put somebody in a vulnerable position for that to happen. So.
Any final payload thoughts?
Practice, practice, practice. And if you haven't practiced, don't take it to a tournament. And if you haven't practiced, ban it in a tournament. And I mean, unless you don't care, but definitely the more practice, if you're going to practice an objective, this is the objective you should be practicing right now.
Yeah. And it's worth setting, like, it's sort of just habit to go through the turn zero process when you're practicing for a tournament. But I think this is one of those situations where if you've got a good practice partner, you just sort of both agree, all right, we're just going to play payload. We can go through turn zero and V2 the other stuff, but our objective for this game is payload.
Yeah.
Just to specifically practice it.
And I also think that, like, when it comes to playing practice games, like, you can almost just, like, lay clear conditions down, pick an objective, pick a deployment, and just play it. Like there are certain deployments that like you should know how to play, and like clearly you should know how to play disarray, but like you can play that a lot less than the other deployments, right? Like disarray is a lot. I mean, it's more common now than it used to be, but some deployments just don't see a ton of play.
Danger close.
I love that deployment, man. I love it. It is.
I want to spend a day in your brain then, because I hate it.
It's like so up my alley. I love Danger Close.
It maybe makes me
like Danger Close and Hemmed In are like my two favorite deployments in this game.
Oh, see, I like Hemmed In. Danger Close makes me feel so uncomfortable. I feel like I'm making the wrong decision so many times when I'm deploying a unit. And I don't like it. I don't like feeling uncomfortable, which is why I don't play payload. Well, because I haven't practiced it.
I like game states where like it's really difficult to make good choices, because I think those are the most interesting games when people are actively making mistakes and they maybe don't know it, even if they're really good. Like if you're playing a Danger Close game and you're playing with like two high competitive players, like somebody definitely screwed up in turn zero, and like somebody definitely screwed up the deployment, and people are like, I don't know. I think it just forces some awesome game states. It's the only deployment I think I've actually felt nauseous setting up the game.
Oh, totally. No, totally. Like that is 100% how I felt the last time I played Danger Close, which I haven't played it often. But like I deployed and I was like, I feel sick to my stomach because I don't know if I deployed correctly. And that's not something I normally feel. Like I feel like I'm pretty good positionally when I play Legion. And if I don't feel like I'm in position, I literally feel like I'm going to puke, because like I'm now off kilter. Like I am now completely not centered to what I'm used to, at least.
Yeah. I just love the possibility of like, turn zero, I scout my DTs or arcs in that like range 3 band. Turn 1, I immediately activate them and take a range 2 shot at this unit you deployed super horribly. And like all of a sudden the game is just like,
you know what's funny is like
really fast, much more so than other objectives.
You know what's funny though is like Danger Close on the face of it is probably really good for like secret mission, but then I deploy.
It's super awesome for secret mission.
Yeah, but I don't know. Maybe it's like tabletop simulator maps, or maybe it's because I've played on Starkiller like a couple times. but like Danger Close on the Star Killer map on Tabletop Simulator, if you're on one side of the board and you think like Danger Close is really good for secret mission, it's actually got like that tower that's in like a really bad spot and will leave you completely exposed from the opposite side of the table. And and maybe it's because I've played Danger Close on that map like 2 or 3 times, and I'm just like, oh, this is great for secret mission. And then I deploy, and I'm like, shit, this is not good for secret mission.
Well, it's notable that Danger Close is the best deployment for Padme because of that. Like you can. I should say it was R2, not Pat. I should say it was R2, not Padme. You can almost guarantee that you go last as like blue player and like infiltrate into their deployment zone and be able to almost immediately retrieve her safely. Like the first action of the game is you just being like, oh, this victory point's mine. I'm just going to run back to my deployment zone now. And it's so good.
I think you did that last Invader and you messaged us and I was like, excuse me, what did you just say?
I did. I think David's camera's frozen again.
That's a pretty good still though. We should leave that one.
You can't hear the rain is like pounding now.
It's okay. We can't hear you either.
You're breaking up pretty good.
Yeah. Let's wrap this puppy up, I think.
I agree. All right. Well, we are the Notorious Scoundrels. I'm Kyle.
I'm Mike.
I'm David.
I'm surprised we're here. David, I'm Zach.
And we'll see you next week. Stay fresh, cheese bags.